and get started. All right, welcome back to another edition of A Value Conversation, Gen X Spoken Word. Find somebody who knows somebody to tell somebody about what we've got going on over here. If you like it, let me know. Share it if you do. And subscribe if it's what you're looking for. All right, folks, as you know, we may not get a lot of traffic here on the initial show sometimes, but I damn sure promise you, views come after everything dies down. So as I always say, I've got nothing but hours that I need to do. So whether people show up or not, we're going to still go ahead and get it in, all right? Take a minute, lay back. Let's let the opening intro do its thing, and we'll get this started. All right, let's go ahead and dive down and get into this, peeps. So as always, I want to say thank you to anyone who has the opportunity to join the show live. Again, we may get some traffic through, we may not get some traffic through, but in the end, it's still facts that I'm here to spit on everybody, right? And I don't mean to take that in a bad way, but understand, you've got to put something out here that people themselves generally won't look for. And that is going to be what I'll call facts. Anyone who's been following me knows that I generally make a rule to put this out here. Facts don't choose sides. People do. But the thing here is that when you get people who have grown up inside of, we'll call it the lie, it's hard for them to listen to anything that's different from what they've been told, what they've been shown, what they've been taught their entire lives. Now, a lot of people hear me make this statement when I talk about Christianity. I walked away from that 30-something years ago when I realized that there was no power in the water. There was no power in the words of anyone who did not want to follow what was being said. You have a choice, and people seem to forget that. And a lot of what we do in Black culture, or what we believe, is what's been given to us in place of the facts that were taken away from us. The best way to convince someone that he or she is without thought, without history, is to take that history away and then supplant it or replace it with something else. Now, the general case here is when you have a nation that's been conquered, is that those conquered folks will end up now following in the footsteps of the conqueror. Whatever it was that made up their religion, their culture, their heritage, if it is a vengeful and ruthless conqueror, all that will be wiped away. And the only thing left that will be followed is that of the conqueror's ways. So I want you to think about this as we go through today's show, all right? The title, The African Prominence Europe Sought to Keep Hidden. Now, if you don't keep up with your history, which a lot of us don't, I have to admit, through the course of my life, after getting out of high school, even college for my undergrad, and even my master's, the concept, the aspect of history, I never really paid attention to. Didn't give it too much thought because I didn't think it had any real benefit or value for what it was that I was doing to earn my money. But then as I interacted more with business, with just individuals in conversation, getting more acclimated with what's happening around me politically, I started to realize that majority of what I lived my life by was a damn lie. And you won't know this unless somebody gives you that open door to walk through to cause you to think differently. So that's what I want to try and do. Because of the fact I've been fortunate enough to be exposed to literature and teachings of Dr. John Henry Clark, Dr. Joseph Binyakini, Dr. Chancellor Williams, Dr. John G. Jackson, Dr. Amos Williams, Dr. Anthony Browder. The list goes on. Some of these gentlemen I still need to read further, but a few of them I base a lot of my reading on, because when I read what they say, I can turn around, go to the internet or find someone who's got a book published written by them, and I can verify what they're saying. I can go to 2 or 3 different sources and get the same story. That's what I want everybody else to be able to do. But if you don't know how to do it, if you don't know who to look for, you're not going to know. That's the purpose of what I want to try and make available to a majority of you. So again, whether I have 5, 10, 20, 100 people, or maybe just 1 or 2, that's all right. At least that one person may know what I'm talking about, and they can take that to somebody else. And then, of course, if the replay game kicks in, then we'll have future comments tagged onto this. All right, so before we go, I want everybody to put your circles up. All right, and repeat after me. Inside this circle exists my anecdotal lived experiences and exposures. Just because Jay says something that I may not understand does not make me an idiot or Jay a liar. It just means I'm unfamiliar with the topic being discussed. So whenever you hear something from me that goes against what you've been told, what you've been, what's been ingrained inside of you, put your circle back up and just take a moment and realize that I might not be lying to you, which I guarantee I'm not going to, intentionally or unintentionally, but it just might be something you're unfamiliar with. So take that as a challenge. So I am not going to be putting any music or any audio video out today. So we'll just go ahead and share the whole screen, so we shouldn't have any feedback or anything. Oh, excuse me. So once again, the topic for tonight: the African prominence Europe sought to keep hidden. So anyone who's been in school has heard of the white man's burden. So this is something that you will hear in grade school, you hear it in high school, and if you become a history major, you'll hear it throughout as well. So the question that I want to ask, the statement I made, provide the bigotry behind the white man's burden. The White Man's Burden, an 1899 poem by Richard Kipling, is rooted in the white supremacist and paternalistic ideology that Western powers had a moral obligation to rule over and civilize non-white populations. Anyone following me knows that I speak about this a lot, especially when it comes to Christianity. So the whole concept of the white man's burden started centuries before. In 1455, Pope Nicholas V sanctioned slavery of Africa, and then of course other nations following that, or should I say other indigenous peoples, anyone who did not worship the fictional God Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. As a result, if they did not, these individuals, or should I say these indigenous peoples, were considered to be savages. And as a result of them being called savages, that made them worthy of rule by the white man or the Europeans. Look at it how you want to call it. White man, Europeans. I say bigoted Europeans. The reason being is that we all know white folks who are not bigoted. We know black folks who are bigoted, as well as black folks who are not bigoted. But I make the distinction when I say bigotry, because I want people to know that there are the European bigots of the past, and then you have the European bigots of today, or the descendants. Even if I say white bigotry, those folks who know me, who have grown up around, who work around me, know that this is not them. Now, on that note, I also make this statement. This platform is not a black platform, it's not a white platform, it's not African American, it's not black American, it's nothing in particular. This is a platform of information. On my platform, we may discuss race because there's a racial aspect to everything that we do. But what I do not engage in is racism. There will be no racism on my platform. There will be hard facts that may result in hard feelings for some folks, but there will not be racism that will be perpetuated. That is an absolute no. All right, so getting back to this, core racist ideologies. And again, this is following up on the white man's burden. Racial hierarchy. The poem assumes that white Europeans and Americans occupy the top of the racial hierarchy, possessing inherent intellectual and moral superiority. Now, how often have we heard this? Now, again, I'm Generation X. I grew up in the 70s, the 80s, and I reached maturity in the 90s. I'll put it this way. To me, I don't think anyone becomes an actual full-on adult until they turn 30. Otherwise, anything before that, that's just a training mission. But still, growing up in that time period, I can recall in the 70s, specifically because I was born 5 years after the Civil Rights Movement. So that's when Jim Crow was pretty much wiped out, or so we thought. But in 1965, the Voting Rights Act came on the heels of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And all of a sudden, now, Blacks / Black Americans / African Americans, known as African descendants, which is what we are. Anyone who is Black born outside of Africa is not Native African, but an African descendant whose ancestry reaches back to Africa. All of that meaning us. I'll just say Black because that's what everyone is familiar with. Blacks were finally able to enjoy the rights and privileges and freedoms, or so we thought, that have been fought for to give us equal standing in American society. But the problem with that is in doing so and embracing and finally having the opportunity of what we believed was the equality of finally being an American citizen and be accepted as such. We didn't take the time to make sure the generations behind us understood what the struggle was to give them the ability to enjoy life, if you want to call it enjoyment, or to engage and have the capabilities to interact that they have today. Generation Y, Generation Z, completely disconnected from the struggle. And that is something that Generation X and the Generation Force will say, the boomers. This is something that is on us. We failed to learn, or not learn, but we failed to teach this. We were in a moment to whereas anything and everything that was denied to us was finally ours to have. And in doing so, and when I mean to having this moment, we indulged, but we did not take enough time to make sure that the next generation knew what the sacrifices were. More on that later. Dehumanizing language. Kipling explicitly characterizes indigenous and colonized peoples as sullen, half devil, and half child, framing them as savage, which I said, primitive, and incapable of self-governance. Now, this is where the aspect of religion comes in, where you would hear, oh, if it weren't for the Lord Jesus Christ and us bringing it to these savages, these infidels, they would not know what it is to be civilized. Now, if my Aunt Barbara and my Aunt Nora have to see this down the road, including my Aunt Beatrice, forgive me, but I want to say that is a crock of shit. As I've said before, many, many times before, the fictional character Jesus Christ is just that fiction. He never existed. Him, God, Noah, Abraham, Moses, none of these individuals existed. They were all stories that were utilized for control and to make sure us brainless savages did not attempt to seek liberation, to strive for freedom, to have our own ideals, to have our own goals. No, our plot in the lives that they depicted for us was slavery, was servitude. And in order to do that, we had to be cast as being animals and mindless in order to justify the slavery that was put upon us. The civilizing mission, it frames imperial conquest and subjugation not as violent, resource-driven exploitation, but as an altruistic, self-sacrificing burden borne by white men to uplift childlike, non-white populations. So people wonder why I give the foundational Black anarchists, or they want to call themselves foundational Black Americans, but people wonder why I give them so much trash. And the reason being is this right here. Whether FBA realizes it or not, they are doing the work of their slave masters. As much as they want to accuse Blacks like myself who identify as African descendant, notice again, I say African descendant, not Native African, because that is what I am not. There's a young man that I met in the mall over here the other day by the name of Papa. And he had made a comment earlier in the chat. I don't know if you're still here or not, Papa, but if you are, go ahead and drop something in here. Otherwise, if you see this on replay, just let people know I'm giving you your shout out, man. This young man is from Africa. I believe he said he was 23 years old. And from what I could tell, he spoke fluent English. And the funny thing is, he said that he learned English watching TV and watching movies. And he engaged quite well in the conversation. He has a passport. I believe he's working on going to school, something along those lines. He's got a job he's holding down. So he is doing everything that you would expect from someone to do if they're in this country working to get a piece of the American dream. But again, the thing here is that as he and I were having discussions, he understood what I was saying when I specified the difference between Native African, which he literally is, and African descendant, which is what I am. But as I told him, in the end, we're still kindred. We're still family. Even though I was not born on the continent of Africa, my roots extend as an African American, as Negro, as Black American, back to enslaved Africans who themselves were taken from Africa. So FBA, if you catch on to this, understand something. Even the settlers who kidnapped the Africans from Africa and put them on plantations, they knew that the African slaves came from Africa. Therefore, when America came to be America, African American was not a stretch. The phrase African American was first documented in 1782, describing a Black man who had written an article about the capture of Lord Cornwallis, to which the person who was speaking of the author, who was Black, said the author was an African American. But not to drift here. Again, I just want to get this clear here that as I read this, I want folks to understand we were billed as being less intelligent than animals. We were primitive, we were savages, and as I said here, incapable of self-governance, which it should well be known now is a lie. Let's move one step further before we get on to the next tab. Pseudoscientific and cultural drivers. Social Darwinism. The ideology relied heavily on 19th century pseudoscientific beliefs that applied evolutionary theories to human societies, arguing that white dominance was a natural law of survival of the fittest. So there was no such thing as color or class or anything like that until Europeans created it in order to have some level of social dominance. But as we get along in this, you're going to understand another reason why this was done. And that was because there was a realization that the people that they wanted to enslave or did enslave had knowledge that far exceeded them, even for what was considered to be current time in the 14th and 15th century. Knowledge from the African continent had already been in decline by the time the first, I guess, notation of white Europeans had even come onto the map. I want to say that was around 13 or 1200 BC. I think it was the writing of the Iliad. But prior to that, even at that point in time, the African dynasties were already in decline. They'd risen, they'd been prosperous, they fought wars, and then they were on their decline. But there was a lot of prominence that was found when archaeological digs, when just the visiting from the countries that were going to become Europe first went to Africa. Now, a lot of the stuff that is mentioned, especially when we talk about when Alexander the Great invaded Egypt or invaded Africa, Europe as we know it did not exist. Context is what's missing from a lot of what's talked about in history. Everyone thinks Germany, Poland, France, Italy, Ukraine or whatnot. They think these places were always there. No, they were not. The cultural center of the world at one point was Egypt, which again is located in Africa. So therefore you had people from countries outside of Africa that were sending their children, or even their folks of higher learning or higher knowledge to Africa to gain more knowledge. More to that to come. Religious and moral sanas. Proponents twisted Christian and Western values to argue that empire building was a duty demanded by God or providence to bring order, infrastructure, and monotheism to heathen societies. Just to put this out here real fast. As I said before, this concept of God never existed. That was something that was created by Europeans when they misinterpreted the Medru Neter, or some call it the Medu Neter. But nonetheless, the Medru Neter, which I'll just say Medru Neter, is what the Europeans converted into people knowing Medru Neter as hieroglyphs. So when they misinterpreted the hieroglyphs, this whole aspect of religion got off to the wrong start, because it was African spirituality that they were attempting to read, to translate, which they mistranslated, but they chopped, screwed, turned it around, came back and said, we have Christianity. But the thing here, folks, is that even when Christianity was first created, it was 2,000 to 3,000 years behind society in Africa that already had their laws to govern the populations. Different story, but just again to make this known here, Christianity was the main tool that was used to tame the savage beast. But the fact of the matter is that the individuals inside of those pages never existed. More on that later. So picking up on what I just mentioned a moment ago, Africa was the center of learning and education before Europe came into existence. This is a fact. But again, if you did not know this, everyone would swear that Europe was the cradle of civilization. No, it was not. More so, Greece was considered to be the cradle of civilization. Again, no, that is not true. The cradle of civilization has always been Africa. But because of the distortion and the interference by Western Asia, by invaders from Western Asia, then invaders from pre-ancient, or should I say ancient Europe to be, Africa has seen their prominence literally go to shit. We've seen achievements that have been hidden, or if not hidden, we've seen them repackaged, and others take credit for that, which we'll be getting into in this particular show. Africa has a rich, independent history of advanced education, literacy, and scholarship long before the arrival of European colonization. If you don't know the right question to ask, you will not get the right answer to present. Ancient and medieval centers of learning. Ancient Egypt and Alexandria. Ancient Egypt developed hieroglyphic. Notice they're saying hieroglyphic. That is not the word. The word was medruneta. But again, it was converted to hieroglyphic because that's how the Europeans translated everything into. Hieroglyphic writing over 5,000 years, establishing one of the earliest monumental systems of literacy, mathematics, medicine, and architecture. Later, the library at Alexandria served as a globally renowned hub for classical scholarship and research. Alexandria being named after Alexander the Great. So any and every bit of history, anything that was documented that we don't know about was inside of this library during the course of its decline. Now, eventually it was overrun, and whatever was left in there was trampled out and never to be seen from again. Or at least that's what a lot of people will say, the historians. Some still say today that there's a possibility that information from that period may still be around, but someone may have it. It may be in someone's private locker someplace. But rest assured, there's a lot of history that we do not have available to us after Alexandria fell. And there is a religious aspect to what I'm speaking about in regards to the library at Alexandria, but there's also the Serapeum. And this is knowledge that was put together in a building, or we'll say a library, that was dedicated to the syncretic god Serapis, or Serapis. I've heard it both ways, but I'll just say Serapis. But nonetheless, Serapis, like every other god, was not a real god. Matter of fact, Serapis was a deity that was crafted after one of Alexander the Great's 4 generals, Ptolemy I Soter, or Ptolemy I Soter. Again, heard it both ways. But this individual was one of the line of white pharaohs that came in that more or less took the African pharaoh dynasty away from black into white. And no, these people were not Egyptians. No, Egypt was not white either. Maybe we'll do that in a different story. Timbuktu and the Sankore University. From the 12th to the 16th century, Timbuktu in Mali was a premier global center for education. The University of Sankore and related institutions hosted thousands of scholars studying astronomy, law, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy, backed by hundreds and thousands of handwritten manuscripts. Now, what you do not see here, what is not seen in this paragraph, is all the teaching that it did before AD. Pythagoras, Thales, Herodotus or Herodotus. Who else? I want to say Socrates, but these are the Greeks who traveled to Egypt to learn in the mystery school. This was nothing more than a lot of the centers that predated what you're seeing right now. You had men who went to school for 40 years. That's all they did. They didn't need money for anything, for clothes, shoes. The people were more than happy enough to make clothes to these individuals because they were the wells of knowledge. These men would spend up to 40 years of their life studying, again, as we just mentioned, math, astronomy, law, medicine, philosophy. And upon that 40-year mark, they were tested to see if they were knowledgeable enough to continue on. So this was a lifetime. So recall the movies if we saw Jason and the Argonauts or something like that. I'm sorry, Jason and the Argonauts, I believe that's how it's expressed. And they always talked about the oracles. And it was either a pool of water that a face would show up in, a mirror on the wall. But these oracles were just people. But these people were skilled and knowledgeable about anything and everything. So when you had people coming from different countries to study, it was because it was known in Africa, primarily Egypt, Timbuktu, or Sankore. This is where knowledge was. The Ge'ez script and accent. Ethiopia developed its own distinct written language, the Ge'ez script, and fostered sophisticated legal, religious, and historical texts over many centuries. So throughout, throughout Africa, you can see there was a level of intelligence in northern, in sub-Saharan. You could find it in numerous places, but again, you would never hear this in today's world. And that's mostly because of 18th and 19th scientific races, 18th, 19th century scientific races. This pseudo nonsense that catered to the fact of any indigenous person that the Lord had to bring knowledge and bring light to was uncivilized, therefore worthy of being domineered and led by the white man. We started the show off with this information. The white man's burden. Anyone who was non-white was considered a savage. Slow scroll. If anyone wants to come back to this for themselves, or better yet, just type in what you see in the tabs. Egypt was the center of education for neighboring countries who sent their children for education before Europe appeared. Now, as you can see, it doesn't keep up too well with voice commands, but it does well enough. Egypt was indeed a major global center of education long before modern European universities gained prominence. For centuries, students from across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia traveled to Egypt to study both religious and secular sciences. Now, who would believe that if you tried to stop someone inside of a comment section who has been bathed in the blood of Jesus and can't be told anything else except that the Bible is the one and only true, truth, whatever you want to say? No, it is not. The Bible does not hold history at all. It holds stories. It does not tabulate the history of the world. Key historic centers. Al-Azhar University, founded in Cairo in 970 CE, is one of the world's oldest degree-granting universities. It became the premier destination for Islamic law, Arabic grammar, rhetoric, and astronomy. Now, one thing I need to point out here, folks. There was a good amount of exchange, or we'll say cultural exchange, between Africans and between the Arabs, based upon the invasion of Africa by the Arabs in, say, the 7th century or so. And during this time, from the 7th century up until maybe, we'll say 800 years, maybe up until about the early 15th century or so, 800 years, the African nations held Iberia, which is Portugal and Spain. But at that time it was known as Iberia. For 800 years, the Africans held this country. But of course, you won't hear it explained as Africans. You'll hear it explained as the Muslims invaded Iberia and controlled it for 800 years. But those Muslims that they're talking about were Africans who had been converted to Islam. I've always talked about this, but we're going to show some of that today. Library of Alexandria, we just read this in the previous tab, but we'll say this again. Established in the 3rd century BCE during the Ptolemaic dynasty, it attracted the greatest scholars of the ancient Mediterranean world for philosophy, mathematics, and medicine. But here's the issue that I have with that. They're talking about the greatest scholars of the ancient Mediterranean. They were not great scholars until they came and studied in ancient Egypt. They were students. They came with no knowledge of what was happening in Egypt. They came without any culture, and they came without any history. But when they left, they had all three. And when they went back to their respective countries, now all of a sudden, they're called the greatest scholars. But no one took the time to recognize where they had learned their craft from. So I've got something that I want to read to you here in a little bit, but we'll wait until we get a little bit further through here, because I want to get to the tab where it talks about those Greeks who came to Egypt to study. The House of Knowledge, Dar al-Hikmah, established in 1005 CE by the Fatimids, it served as a massive public library and teaching institute for science, mathematics, and philosophy. The impact on neighboring regions. Scholarships. Egypt provided stipends and free housing for international students through a system of endowments. Residential quarters. Al-Azhar built dedicated residential wings for students for specific regions, such as the Riwaq of the Levant or Riwaq of the Sudanese. Knowledge transfer. Graduates returned to their home countries as judges, teachers, and administrators, shaping the legal and educational systems of their societies. So we can see right here, we talk about the aspect of law, where it came from. Well, I can't say it all did, but the initial aspect of it began in Africa. And then throughout time, countries that had people who had received training from these folks modified what they learned to fit whatever situation or fit whatever environment that they existed in. All right, slow scroll. I think that's about it. On to the next. Now, I've just had a moment here where I spoke about the supposed great scholars of the Mediterranean. Again, when these individuals came to Africa, they were not great scholars. They were great students who left as scholars. Context is important. Egypt was a cultural center of knowledge the Greeks attended. Ancient Egypt was a major center of learning and wisdom that many famous ancient Greek scholars visited and studied. They became scholars after they left. Maybe I'm being biased, but if you go someplace to learn, to become a scholar, how are you showing up as a great scholar? Why Greeks traveled to Egypt. Advanced math. Egyptians used geometry and measurements long before the Greeks. Medical knowledge. Egyptian doctors had detailed texts on surgery and the human body. Now think about this, and I think I've said this more than enough in a few earlier shows. The Hippocratic Oath, that is what doctors today still pledge their allegiance to. But what people don't realize is that Hippocrates learned from an African surgeon who existed 1,500 to 2,000 years before he was even born, Imhotep. Imhotep was one of the world's first polymaths. Not only was he the father of medicine as we know it, he was also the designer of the pyramids. Yeah, this cat had game. But no one knows this man's name unless you're in the annals or the halls of education. Unless you exist inside of this field, or I shouldn't call it a field, unless you exist in learning knowledge and you're a lifelong student of somewhat, you would never know the name Imhotep. But when you get a cut on your finger, a bruise, or a leg, the guy who comes in to see you, the doctor, he's taking the Hippocratic Oath, as opposed to what it should be called the Oath of Imhotep. And I do believe there's some places in the world who actually call it the Oath of Imhotep or something similar. Again, just some trivia if you weren't aware of that. Temple schools. Egyptian priests held centuries of astronomical and philosophical records. Now, keep in mind what I said before, that you had men who went to school for 40 years, 40 years before they were tested to see if they knew enough to continue on for another 30. So you're talking about 70 years of your life that you spent in school before you were actually put forth to be seen as an oracle, a seer or a protector of knowledge. Famous Greek visitors. Pythagoras. Ancient writers report he spent years learning geometry and math from the Egyptian priests. Roughly about 22, I believe. Plato. He traveled to Egypt and later praised the depth of their education system. Thales. Considered an early Greek philosopher who studied science and math in Egypt. Herodotus. The Greek historian wrote extensive accounts describing Egypt as a core source of ancient civilization. But matter of fact, people don't know this, Greek civilization came to be because of what was taken from ancient Egypt. Even Alexander the Greek wrote home to his mother in a letter stating that he had found the origins of Greek society. Now, by that time, you'd have numerous visits from the Greeks to ancient Egypt by the time Philip had invaded. Philip was Alexander's father, Philip of Macedonia. But again, Alexander the Great came to Egypt, and after time spent there, saw where the culture that he grew up in had actually come from. But again, you don't hear this, you don't have this written, you don't have it put out in front, because to hear this would upstage the lie that we've all been sold over the course of our lifetime, which has existed for over 2 millennia. Well, let's just keep it going. All right, slow scroll. Egypt was an educational hub 3,000 years before the existence of Europe. As I said before, this is a fact, but no one really knows this because it is not spoken of, because again, it would deter and detract from the falsehoods that we've learned and been fed over the course of our lives. Ancient Egypt emerged as a unified, literate civilization around 3100 BC, long before complex urban European civilizations like classical Greece took form. It's a shame I don't have a large enough audience from the live shows, but I still get a lot of my comments that come back from this, especially from white supremacists. Oh, that's a lie. Blacks don't know anything. We had to teach you everything. You guys were climbing in trees when we came to your rescue. Who the hell do you think we're rescuing? The other way around, we rescued you. If anyone has looked at any of the first interactions of European settlers with the indigenous folks literally had to pull their asses out of the mouths of lions, crocodiles. I'm being facetious right now. Lions, hippopotamuses, crocodiles, who knows what, or at least save them from starvation. Now, again, I say that with some humor, but ideally, yes, it was the natives of those lands that they visited who ensured that they survived long enough to take what the natives had provided to them in friendship. And then, of course, you got murder, subjugation, and the eventual enslavement of those indigenous populations by the people that were shown mercy when they first visited. Yeah, I still need to do a show on that, but in due time. Staying where we are. Foundation of Egyptian learning, scribal training. Formal schools run by priests and government scribes taught reading, hieroglyphics, there's that word substitute of major nature again, mathematics and administration, houses of life. Temple-affiliated centers, Prague, served as advanced libraries and research hubs for medicine, astronomy, and theology, practical sciences. Egyptians mastered geometry, engineering, and a 365-day solar calendar to manage agriculture and monumental architecture. Now, the crazy thing here, you hear me saying Egyptians a lot. Egypt is located in Africa. It is still in Africa. It has always been in Africa. There was a point in time where you had European, I'll just say where European influence was trying to convince folks that Egypt was not in Africa and that Egypt had been white always. Now, anyone who has looked at a map of Africa, who's looked at the population of Africa, knows damn well, or as I remember as my dad used to speak before he got saved by the Holy Ghost, everyone knew good and goddamn well that there were no white folks in Egypt. Absolutely not. But it's amazing what lies that you will get from the Bible or just scientific racists. Moving on. Timeline contrast with Europe. Europe's early context. While humans lived in parts of Europe during the Stone Age and built early megaliths like Stonehenge, large-scale literate civilizations and formal education systems did not develop there until much later. Classical transmission. Centuries later, Greek philosophers and mathematicians such as Pythagoras and Plato traveled to Egypt to study geometry, philosophy, and medicine from Egyptian priests and scholars, which I pretty much said, did I not? Now, a lot of what I'm speaking about has come from numerous lessons over and over again from, again, Drs. John Henry Clark, Dr. Joseph Benyakin, including some from Dr. John G. Jackson. And I know this from having listened and gone through these lectures, gone out to the internet, gone to Amazon bookstore based upon their recommendations and bought books that showed this information, that pretty much relayed what I was hearing from them from different authors that they were sharing these notes from, who had validated and stated what was known to be true or what is true but is not fully known right now. African prominence far exceeded that of of soon to be Europe by a minimum of 3,000 to 5,000 years. But all that has been put to the wayside, hidden in books, or the accomplishments given to someone else who was not of an indigenous nature. Let's keep going. Again, slow scroll back up. If you want to see what I've got or something close to it, type this in. But if you do not get the exact same information, again, that's why I do my slow scrolls now, to make sure you grab any information that I'm sharing. Knowledge of Africans capturing Iberia is shrouded under the heading of Muslims taking control. Now, this goes back to what I was just saying a moment ago, where I mentioned that when Iberia was taken over for almost 800 years by the Muslims, it wasn't exactly Muslims who did it. It was Muslims in name and Muslims in faith. But in actuality, they were Africans. The historical framework describing the 711 CE invasion of Iberia primarily as a Muslim conquest or an Arab invasion often overshadows the reality that the campaign was overwhelmingly African in geographic origin, manpower, and leadership. While organized under the religious banner of Umayyad Caliphate, the vast majority of the soldiers, generals, and subsequent ruling dynasties were native North Africans. So, how many of you heard that while you were in elementary school, middle school, high school, hell, even college? How many people actually know this? You always hear people saying that, oh, Africans never conquered anything. They've always been conquered. Not true. Now, the aspect is true. There's always been some type of conquering force that has come into Africa, starting in, I want to say, 1700 BC. But Africa, in and of itself, did achieve outward invasion at one point in time. The greatest invasion of theirs was the taking of Iberia for about 800 years. But here's the timeline that people don't seem to put together. Does everyone remember the talk of the Crusades from England? I think, was it Richard the Lionhearted that they talked about? Remember the Crusades? Oh, we've got to do something about the Muslim hordes. Guess who those Muslim hordes were? The Africans. But they were called Moors, if you ever look at the speech of the time, because you had the Moors and the Berbers who existed in upper Africa, at least around Egypt, in that particular area. I'll have to go back and be a little bit more clear about that. But Moors, that is something that you would hear that was referred to a person of African descent if they were outside of Africa. Moving on. The force was overwhelmingly indigenous African. The troops, the initial army that crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, consisted of approximately 7,000 to 12,000 men. Of these, the vast majority were Amazigh, here we go, Berbers, the indigenous people of North Africa, with only a small minority of Arab commanders and administrative officers. The leadership. The invasion was launched by Tariq ibn Ziyad, a military governor of Africa, Berber origin. Now, also, you have to take note that a lot of the Africans had taken on Arabic names. So when you see a good portion of Africans these days who are Muslim, understand that they are Muslim only because of the fact they are descendants of the invaders who came to Africa. I remember a statement by Dr. Clark saying that if you met an Arab or black man from Africa who had an Arab name, he was most likely the descendant of an invader, Or, as he was more pointed to say, anyone in Africa with an Arabic name was either the descendant of an invader or one of the invaders. He did not mix his words sometimes. All right, religious identifiers eclipse geographic ones. In medieval historiography, European Christian chronicles routinely categorized external threats by religion rather than continent. Because the African forces practiced Islam, they were collectively labeled as Saracens, Ishmaelites, or infidels. Centuries later, Eurocentric historians preferred the religious binary of Christian Europe versus the Islamic world. See how this plays out? This framing effectively decentralized the African continent's direct role, treating the campaign strictly as an expansion of an empire based in Damascus. The ambiguity of the term Moor. The term Moor was historically used by Europeans to describe the inhabitants of Al-Andalus, but its definition shifted constantly. Roman origins. It originally derived from Maori, a Latin term explicitly designating the inhabitants of the ancient North African kingdom of Mauritania, modern-day Morocco, and Algeria. Evolution of the term. Over time, Moor became an imprecise catch-all term. It was used interchangeably to mean any Muslim, anyone from North Africa, or anyone with dark skin, which stripped the group of its specific ethnic and geographic African identities. Does any of this sound familiar? This is the practice that Europe took everywhere they went by boat. Everywhere. And they used this same thought process when dealing with those indigenous peoples. As I have said before, there has never been an indigenous people that the European settlers did not come across that they did not subjugate, oppress, or enslave. And this is where that mentality came from. And subsequent African dynasties. Since we've already been through this one pretty much, we'll go ahead and finish it out because I've got a lot less tabs than I usually do, which means I'm going to probably end up having more shows. But I want to try and condense the time down that I do some of these shows in, folks. African control of Iberia was not a singular event, but an enduring presence sustained by waves of North African empires. The Almoravids, 1086 to 1147, a puritanical Berber dynasty originating from the Sahara and Morocco who crossed into Spain to halt the Christian advance, effectively unifying Al-Andalus under Moroccan rule. Now here we go, the Christian advance. See, a lot of folks don't take the time to pinpoint or run your threads to see how time periods intersect. Separately, I recall when I lived in England, and also lived in Europe, but primarily when I was going to school in England, learning British history, there was the talk about the Crusades. But what I found to be interesting is maybe over the last 2 or 3 years, when looking more closely at the history of the world, when they talked about the Crusades, at no point in time did I put it together at that time that they were talking about Africans who were converted to Islam, who had taken over Iberia. So it was funny to look at it from the perspective on this side as I read about the Muslim invasion, aka the invasion of Africans who were converted into Islam, who were facing off against the Europeans who were in that area because of the Crusades. How cool is that, right? Then again, maybe it's just me. The Almohads, 1147 to 1212, another powerful Berber empire originating from the Atlas Mountains of Morocco that replaced the Almoravids and ruled both North Africa and southern Spain. And here we have a brief chart of the groups that came in waves to control, as long as they could, Iberia, which is formerly known, or which is now known as Spain and Portugal. Slow scroll and back up. All right, so we're through our first section. So let me make a shameless plug. Find somebody who knows somebody to tell somebody about what we've got going on. If you like it, let me know. Share it if you do. And subscribe if this is what you're looking for. All right, making good time. So up until now, I realize that I've only got one person watching here, but for those who are watching the replay game, give me your thoughts. Let me know. Did you have any knowledge of the information that I've just shared prior to tonight's show? And if not, let me know what you found to be the most interesting of facts that you did not know until tonight. If you did know, explain some to me. Educate me about what you know. All right, this is supposed to be an exchange, so let's do that. All right, let's keep pressing. So now let's take a time to see where all this bigotry came from, how it was used, and who was responsible for using it. So here's the question that I asked, or here's the statement that I made, actually. List the primary proponents of the scientific racism used to discredit the achievements of ancient Africa. The primary proponents of scientific racism who worked to discredit the achievements of ancient African civilizations, most notably by stripping ancient Egypt and Great Zimbabwe of their African identity, were key figures in the 19th and early 20th century anthropology, ethnology, and archaeology. To justify slavery and colonial conquest, these individuals formulated theories asserting that sub-Saharan Africans were incapable of building advanced societies. Instead, they attributed African monuments to external non-Black populations through frameworks like polygenism, the belief that human races have different origins, and the Hamitic hypothesis, the theory that any advanced African culture was brought by light-skinned conquerors. As I said, the bigotry that existed between the 18th and 19th century was fanatical. No one wanted to give any type of credence to a dark-skinned individual as showing intellect. Now, in a previous show or a few shows, I mentioned that there was running water, there was toilets in houses during the period of 1200 BC or around there, long before Europeans caught on to this, long before they were even wearing shoes or windows they had in their houses. But you are not going to hear this because of the distortion and the more or less the hiding of truth and fact that has gone on for over 800 years or even longer. The American School of Ethnology, proponents of polygenism. In the mid 19th century, a prominent group of American scientists weaponized craniometry, skull measurement. I think it was also known as phrenology as well, spelled Phrenology, phrenology. Look that up when you get a chance if you're interested. To argue that ancient Egyptians were Caucasian. See, there's the lie I mentioned earlier, thereby attempting to prove that Black people had historically only been servants or slaves. So look at this. There you have it. Anytime you mention Blacks in any type of time period, doesn't matter when, the perception is that we were always slaves, or if we weren't, we should have been, and if we were, we deserve to be. As we started in the earlier tabs, there was knowledge and intelligence 5,000 years before Europe even had its first house or even its window to speak of, along with a pot of piss to throw out of it. Samuel George Morton, 1799 to 1851, widely considered the father of scientific racism in the United States. Morton collected and measured human skulls. In his 1844 book, Crania Aegyptiaca, well, we'll leave it at this. Wow. He analyzed skulls from Egyptian tombs and concluded that the builders of ancient Egypt were Caucasians, arguing that Black Africans were socially isolated and inferior since antiquity. No, that was not the case. Because again, if you look at the continent of Africa, Africa is in an equatorial zone, also known as a tropical zone. Because of being in this specific zone, there is a highly inordinate amount of ultraviolet rays that pierce through. As a result, inhabitants of that region are in constant reception of those ultraviolet rays, resulting in the melanation that we see here. Although my melanation is not as severe, or I shouldn't say severe, but as deep as those of Native Africans. Papa, the young man I mentioned earlier who stopped through for a minute, I'll probably have a picture of him next show. But if you were to look at him, he had that dark, glossy skin tone, but you could tell that he was African. If you've traveled the world, you knew by looking at him that he was African. Now, if that's the case of general population, where do these white folks come from? At some point in time, folks are trying to say that these white individuals came from the Caucasus Mountains, came all the way across what is now Europe, crossed either at the Strait of Gibraltar or whatever they did, came across a landmass, built the pyramids, and then went back to where they came from. This is the type of shit, this is the type of stuff you would hear, anything and everything to try and take away from the fact that Africa was culturally advanced before Europe came to be present. Josiah C. Knott, 1804 to 1873, and George Glidden, 1809 to 1857. Excuse me. Collaborators of Morton, who co-authored the highly influential Types of Mankind, 1854. Glidden, an English Egyptologist, provided Egyptian artifacts, while Knott used them to defend Southern slavery. They explicitly argued that complex architectures and writing in Africa could not have been created by indigenous black people. And you wonder why racism is so bad or is still lingering, because you have people who cling to these lies that we're reading right now. They still believe that these men were not wrong in their bigotry. So therefore, an individual like myself, I will not claim to be the smartest man in there, but I'm far from the dumbest. As I mentioned before, I have a high school diploma, I have my associate degree, I have a bachelor's, I have a master's. I'm working on a doctorate that I've got on hold right now. I've got multiple IT certifications showing that I know the knowledge of what I do on a day-to-day basis to earn my living, but yet I would still be considered an incompetent savage based on someone who refused to look at my credentials and just look at me for what is in front of them. And what justifies that? This bullshit right here. Louise Agassiz, a Harvard biologist who championed the theory of polygenism, he claimed that black people belong to a separate biologically inferior species, lending massive institutional authority to the erasure of Africans' contribution to human civilization. Boom. Again, these are the collection of bigots that I routinely talk about when I mention scientific racism of the 18th and 19th century. These are the guys. And we'll just do a quick scroll here because there's just way too many of them that I'll read right now. But again, I just want to make sure that if you look this up yourself, you will see where all these lies about black, or should I say the lack of black intelligence, came from. These are the scientific racists, the pseudoscientists, the people responsible for scientific racism that I've mentioned through various shows. If you want to know who they are, here's the list. All right, let's jump over. Europeans used bigotry to justify the undermining of Africa's prominence. European powers used racial bigotry and white supremacist ideologies to justify the transatlantic slave trade and colonial conquest. So what are the mechanisms that we're discussing right now? Ideological framing. Europeans branded colonial conquest as civilizing missions to mask exploitation. Now recall where I made the statement earlier, whereas I made a jokingly, yes, I say it as a joke, but it was serious. Oh, if it weren't for us taking the word of Jesus to these savages, they would never know civilization. They would never know civility. This is that nonsense that more or less substantiated it. This is the validation that was needed to call anyone who was non-white and of an indigenous nature a savage and mindless creature. Dehumanization. Africans were portrayed as primitive, unintelligent, or animalistic to legitimize chattel slavery. Erasure of history. Colonizers dismissed oral traditions and downplayed indigenous accomplishments to claim Africa lacked a meaningful history. Now, this is something that Dr. Clark spoke about. He had mentioned when he had, when he had rolled up on one of the professors of history at the time, or Egyptology, that he looked up to. He said that he called this man at his lunch hour, and being a young and spry individual as he was, even though he'd only finished school up to the 7th grade, he taught himself how to read. And going through his young adult life, to his teenage years up to his young adult years in his early 20s, he said that he had been fortunate enough to work for white families that had good libraries. And as a result, he would take books from their library because, hell, in his own words, it wasn't like they were really reading them. So he would borrow some books, some he brought back, some he didn't. But this is how he gained his knowledge of the world. I want to say the individual he spoke to may have been Albert Churchward. I'm not sure. I need to go back and verify that. But nonetheless, the man he spoke to told him, son, if you want to know anything about your people, Read the history of your oppressor. Understand that the history of your people are the missing pages of world history. Again, this is what Dr. Clark spoke of. And from there, Dr. Clark talked about how accomplishments and achievements had been overshadowed or even given away to folks who had not earned the right to claim them. But again, if we don't know our history, then by not knowing our history, we'll never even know the history of those who have oppressed us. I'm not saying everyone needs to pick up a book and dive into it, but have a general idea of where to go if something does not sound right. But again, you will not know if it doesn't sound right if you haven't educated yourself to a fair degree. Let's keep pressing. Systemic hierarchies. By the 18th and 19th centuries, racial frameworks explicitly linked freedom and capability to whiteness while assigning servitude to non-whites. So based upon this bigotry, anyone of an indigenous nature was never construed to be intelligent. We were always going to be the workers. We were always going to be subjugated. We were always going to be enslaved because, again, per the white man's burden, it was the job of the white man to bring mercy to us savages. Europe made unsubstantiated claims that Africa had no history. Now, this is something else that Dr. Clark talked about that led him down his path of wanting to know more about his culture as being Black in America, soon where he recognized African American, or this better yet, African descendant. Although he didn't use that word, but he always made sure to let people know it doesn't matter where the boat dropped us off. What matters is where it took us from. And recognizing that we were taken from Africa, as this said in his own words, Africa will always be our ancestral home. The claim that Africa had no history was a false Eurocentric narrative historically used by European thinkers and colonial powers to justify exploitation and colonialism. That is the case. It is still used now. How often have you heard someone say, oh, you know what, Africans were selling their own people into slavery? No, we were not. Or should I say, no, they were not. See, this is that false conflation, or excuse me, that false equivalency that's utilized by folks who want to try and make it seem like their part in slavery wasn't really that bad because they were doing it too. No, Africans were not doing it. In Africa, you had a mild form of slavery, if we're going to have to call it slavery, that was viewed and known as indentured servitude and bondsmanship. This meant that if there was a war between two warring villages, the village that lost ended up becoming indentured servants to the conquering village. So what was indentured servitude made of? You're talking about people who were captured in war, who were prisoners of wars, people who were guilty of theft, and then you have those who were in debtor's prison. And then, of course, there was bondsmanship, meaning that if there was work to be done and a person couldn't pay for it with money, well, here, take my son Joseph. You can keep him for a while. He'll work off whatever's needed. So you're talking about a period of 7 to 10 years that people were in indentured servitude. And when they had served that time, they could either join into the society that they were held in, or they could go back to where they were taken from, provided that it had not been completely wiped out. In some instances, people had gone back to where the village had rebuilt itself, and this person was invited back. Although there was some skepticism, because that individual had been gone so long, the question is, where does his or her loyalties lie? Different story. Now, for those who stayed, they were accepted into the society where they were spending their servitude. Some would even marry the daughters and marry into the family of those folks who had enslaved them, and they would even stay to the point of taking office if that were the case. Notice, I did not say that when they were enslaved, they stayed slaves, and then the children that were had with these people were slaves also. No, that was chattel slavery. That was a European invention. So there are plenty of myths that exist. But no, Africans were not selling their own into slavery, as it was put this way. If anything, towards the end, before the transatlantic slave trade kicked off, the Europeans would come to a tribe, say, hey, I see that you got an issue with Mobutu over there, but yeah, if you use this gun, you'll be able to quell whatever he brings to your way, and you'll be able to better defend your folks. They would go to the other tribe. Hey, Ondasu, I see is a bit of an issue for you, but I'll tell you what, hey, I got these guns you can use. You can use this against him to secure your village. And eventually, you go from this thing of indentured slavery, indentured servitude, where you have one taking the other's folks for a period of 7 to 10 years, to now as they're taking these folks, but then giving them to to the Europeans to put in chains. This is the same technique that was used multiple times, used on the Tano Indians and the Creole in Little Haiti in the Caribbean, used on the folks in Tasmania off the coast of Australia, used with the Indians, North America. All right, this was a continually used technique. And what do they say about some things? If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Historical realities, advanced civilizations. You know, I think I missed one, didn't I? Actually, I think I missed two. Let's go back up to why the myth was created. Colonial justification. European colonizers framed expansion as bringing civilization to regions they falsely claim were blank slates or unknown. Philosophical bias. Figures like the philosopher G.W.F. Hegel dismissed African civilizations and claimed the continent was outside the course of historical progress. Dismissal of oral tradition. Traditional Western historiography ignored rich oral histories, viewing the absence of Western-style written records as a lack of history. So therefore, if the white man didn't write it, then it didn't happen. Now, for those of you who do not know this, and hey, shout out to my man, Chicago Gorilla. I believe he may be working right about now, otherwise he would have had the opportunity to be here. You had the griots, and the griots were those individuals in villages who maintained the history, who told the stories. These are the individuals that were missing or who were generally ignored by the Westerners. Therefore, again, if the European did not write it, it did not happen, although the story was captured and maintained by the griots, who you can look at as being a down the road extension of what I want to say, of the oracles, of the mystery schools of Egypt. Yeah, the bigotry is bad, folks. Historical realities. Advanced civilizations. Africa was home to complex, organized empires long before European contact, including Kush, Aksum, Mali, Songhai, Great Zimbabwe, and the Ashanti Kingdom. Written traditions. Indigenous writing systems of major intellectual centers, such as the libraries at the University of Timbuktu, alongside the Ge'ez script in Ethiopia, flourished for centuries, as we saw and I mentioned previously. Sophisticated governance. Many pre-colonial states featured advanced political institutions, trade networks, and legislative bodies like the Ashanti Kotoko Council. All right, slow scroll. So if there's any question about what had happened or what had gone on with Africa and its loss of history, this should have explained it. Up until now, we're an hour and 20 into this. And it goes fast, does it not? But from this hour and 20, from the time we start up until now, you can see where the lies have been told that has taken away the prominence of Africa, where it's still kept this way even today. Think about this. People always say that Africa is a poor country, but yet if it's so poor, why is it everyone is over there ironing the ore, ironing the zinc, mining anything that they can to take back to their countries to use to make to make the economy and what it is. But these economies around the world would not exist if Africa and the countries in Africa would say no more. You're not taking our oil, you're not taking our zinc, you're not taking our minerals, you're not taking any of our resources, you're taking nothing. Imagine how the economies around the world would fall. Then, of course, you'd have someone like Donald Trump sending the military over here to attack people in their own country because of the fact that America can no longer just freely take the resources for their own. Same thing with France, same thing with Germany. Everybody's all cool, everyone has guns, right? Or if they have leverage over the people who own the resources. Just something to keep in mind. All right, we're making good time here. We may be done here by an hour 30, hour 45. How often do we do that? We don't have the time. Once more, shameful plug. Find somebody who knows somebody to tell somebody about what we've got going on. If you like it, let me know. Share it if you do. And subscribe. This is what you're looking for. Also, what I've forgotten to do here, go back and take a look. Did not realize until just now looking. There we go. There's our banner. I cannot believe it has been almost an hour and some change and I did not have this up. So take note, folks. There is the Cash App. So for anyone watching right now, get your mans up. Use a little bit of change, keep it going. Or if not, anyone looking at this in the replay, by all means, show your love. What I want to do now is start focusing on growing what we're doing here. I need more folks to make sure that we tell this story properly. All right, our final tab section. So this was the part where I wanted to just stop and see exactly what is being used on a day-to-day basis that people don't realize was created by African Americans who are, we'll say, Black/Black American, to include ancient Africans. So I started with 15 and I went up to 30, but I'll just scroll through the list and show you what I wanted to see if I just increase the numbers to show how many achievements have not been properly attributed to the actual creators and inventors. Provide a detailed list of no less than 15 achievements Africans and modern African Americans had stolen from them and attributed to European individuals. Throughout history, the intellectual and technological achievements of Africans and African Americans have frequently been suppressed, legally hijacked, or outright misattributed to European individuals and corporations. Historically, systemic barriers like U.S. patent laws pre-1865 legally barred enslaved people from holding patents, while colonial biases in Africa routinely dismissed indigenous engineering and science as too advanced to have been built by Black populations. Here is a detailed list of 15 major achievements, inventions, and discoveries that were stolen from or credited away from African and African American inventors. So under the heading of scientific and industrial breakthroughs, the multiplex railway telegraph, the true innovator, Granville T. Woods, African American, attributed to Thomas Edison. The reality, Woods invented the synchronous multiplex railway telegraph in 1887, allowing moving trains to communicate with stations. Thomas Edison approving his prior invention, yet Edison remains globally famous for electrical telegraphy infrastructure. The carbon light bulb filament, the true innovator, Lewis Latimer, attributed to Thomas Edison. The reality, Edison's original 1879 light bulb relied on a paper filament that burned out in just a few hours. In 1881, Latimer invented and patented the carbon filament, which made light bulbs long-lasting, practical, and commercially viable for public use. The mechanical cotton scraper, the true innovator, an enslaved man known as Ned, it's like Steve, attributed to Oscar J.E. Stewart. As you can see, white enslaver. The reality, in 1857, Ned invented a highly efficient cotton scraper. His enslaver, Oscar Stewart, attempted to patent it in his own name. The U.S. Patent Office ruled that because Ned was enslaved, he was not a citizen and could not take an inventor's oath. However, it also ruled Stewart could not steal the credit. Stewart openly marketed and profited from Ned's architecture anyway. God damn. The cotton gin enhancements. The true innovator, enslaved laborers on the plantation of Catherine Green, attributed to Eli Whitney. And we all know from grade school and high school Eli Whitney's cotton gin. The reality, while Whitney patented the machine in 1793, historical records and oral history show that enslaved laborers provided the core mechanical concepts for separating seed from fiber. Enslaved people were legally prevented from patenting ideas, leading Whitney to claim sole credit. So again, this particular jaunt of mine, I pulled about 15 achievements that were created by Africans or African Americans and stolen from them. So what do we have here? The shallow water steamboat propeller, the corded bedstead, medical and mathematical advancements, smallpox variolation, inoculation. The true innovator. I want to read this one because we know how much vaccines cause an issue here in America nowadays. The true innovator. That Onesimus, or we'll just say Onesimus, enslaved West African man, attributed to Cotton Mather and Zabdiel Boylston. The reality, during the 1721 Boston smallpox epidemic, Onesimus explained to his enslaver, Cotton Mather, that the traditional West African practice of rubbing pus from an infected person into a broken skin scratch to grant immunity. Mather used this information to push for inoculations, a practice that saved Boston and laid the groundwork for modern vaccinology. Though Onesimus was mostly erased from early medical textbooks. This is something that I did not know. But I'll bet you money, now that I do, you may see me in a lot of vaccine conversations making this information known. Just because I want to. But moving forward. Advanced antiseptic cesarean sections. High temperature carbon steel production. Excuse me. Early mathematical calculation systems. The true innovators. Ancient Central East Africans, creators of the Ishango and Lobombo bones. Attributed to ancient Greeks and early Europeans. The reality. Long before Greek mathematics, Africans utilized tool tallies for complex calculation. Lobombo bone, Swaziland, 35,000 BC, and Ishango bone, Congo, 20,000 BC, represent the world's oldest mathematical tools, featuring prime numbers and multiplication groupings. Yet European education typically starts math history with Pythagoras. I can't really say too much more about this. We see where the theft is and who stole it. Again, hard facts may cause hard feelings, but facts don't choose sides. People do. Consumer goods, infrastructure and culture. We have the traffic signal and gas mask. I believe that's Garrett Morgan. Yep. Industrial clothes ringer. Ellen Eglin. The shoe lasting machine. John Metzger. The architecture of Great Zimbabwe. The true inventors, the Shona people. And early rock and roll and blues. The true innovators, Big Boy Crudup, or Arthur Big Boy Crudup, and Big Mama Thornton. Now, again, this was just 15, right? 15 known innovations that were stolen. So then I told myself, how about we see if there's anything along the lines of 20 or more? So we have inoculation again. The incandescent light bulb, we discussed that. The blood bank, yeah, Charles Drew. Stereo sections. The traffic light, that was Garrett again. The gas mask, that was Garrett Morgan also. Mathematical and art, architectural feats. Advanced mathematics, is the Shingo Bone, the Pythagorean theorem foundations. Stolen, we know that it was the ancient Egyptians, or they all called it Kemet as well. But of course, because Pythagoras traveled over there, he was considered a great scholar before getting there. But imagine what he was after he came back. But nonetheless, we know that was another stolen concept that no one really knows was actually attributed to Egyptian teachings, aka African. So let me do a slow scroll here. Oh, here's another good one, by the way. The layout of Washington, D.C. They normally talk about the Washington Monument. I don't think this is that particular thing. There's so many monuments that you have in Washington that came from Africa. You'd be amazed if you stopped to take a look at it. Stolen achievement. The astronomical and geometric surveying of the U.S. capital city. The creator, Benjamin Banneker, a free black mathematician and astronomer. European credit, Major Andrew Ellicott, and French engineer Pierre Lafont are heavily credited, though Banneker recreated the entire plan from memory when Lafont left. Man, sounds like a polymath. Industrial and agricultural discoveries, automation of sugar refining, a lubricating cup. Here, let me just do a slow scroll. But take this in, people. This is everything that we look at on a day-to-day basis that can be attributed to African Americans that was stolen and reattributed to somebody else. And lastly, so this time I said provide a list or a detailed list of no less than 30 achievements. And it just runs. Now we see that there's going to be something we already saw in the first two tabs, but understand that there's still more to be found in this one. Too much to be read right now, but you know what? Let's go ahead and put a pin in it because we're at an hour and 30 minutes, which is not too bad, but still, if you would like to see the same information that I provided here, let me do a semi slow scroll. 18, everyday household inventions, curved automatic elevator, modern technological medical. And I'm betting money, if I put in show 40, I would probably find 40 inventions. Who knows how far you can go with this list. But take it for yourselves, folks, and see what you come up with. The basic information, again, that I used to pull this list, provide a detailed list of no less than 20, 30, 40, 60. Try your luck and see what you get. But use this information right here, excuse me, and see what you find. All right. So we had somewhat of a quiet night here. But again, I've got hours to do, so whether you join me now or you see this in the replay, doesn't make any difference to me. The thing here is that I want the information to be out here. So if anyone watching this, all two of you, and anyone watching the replay game decides they want to share this information, you know where you can go to get it. Facts do not hide from folks, people, all right? They do not hide. They don't choose sides either. People choose sides. So the information is here if you want it, and I want to make sure that if you need it, you know where to go to get it. All right, that is pretty much it for me. So I appreciate folks here taking the time, the one or two folks from there out of the clouds watching, but most importantly, I appreciate anyone who's going to watch this in the replay. Please, as I said before, ask me questions. Let me know. Shoot me an email. Let me know what you thought of tonight's show. and let me know if there's any interest in what you may want me to present down the road, all right? Other than that, find somebody who knows somebody to tell somebody about what we've got going on over here. If you like it, let me know. Share it if you do. And subscribe. This is what you're looking for. Until next time.